Hi, I'm Kate from dailytarotgirl.com, and in this video I want to talk about 8 rules for tarot reading that you can just feel free to ignore. So 8 rules to totally ignore. So when I first got into tarot reading, I came across all these weird conflicting ideas, these myths and guidelines for reading tarot, like, you know, always choose the cards with your left hand and always cut to the left, and you know, you have to wrap your deck in silk, etc., etc. And honestly, I found all of this totally confusing, and I know that there's other people out there who also find this confusing. So I want to clear up a few myths about tarot. So I'm going to give you 8 rules that you can feel free to ignore, and then I'm going to give you 4 rules that you should follow. So rule number 1 is that you must be gifted your first tarot deck. So you can't just go out and buy your first tarot deck. And I don't know who came up with this idea, but I totally hate it. So if I waited for someone to gift me a tarot deck before I started learning tarot, I would still be waiting. So I still would not know how to read tarot. So I bought my very first deck, and I've bought most of my decks actually. So this is definitely a rule that you can ignore. I don't know who came up with this or why you're supposed to have a deck gifted to you. I'm not sure, but feel free to ignore this one. So the second rule is that you shouldn't let others touch your cards. And the idea behind this is that if someone else touches your cards, they're gonna energetically contaminate your cards, and then when you read for someone else, it's going to kind of mess up the reading. Your cards are going to be energetically contaminated. And I think this is silly because ideally you should be cleaning your tarot or clearing your tarot deck between each reading. And there's all different ways you can clear a tarot deck. So my method is I will just knock on my tarot deck. So I'll just be like, and then I'll shuffle the cards. And when I shuffle the cards, I have the intention that that shuffling is clearing any energy that may have gotten stuck to the cards. Yeah, so that's a rule I think that you can ignore unless you've been going by this rule for a while and you just feel comfortable you know, not letting others touch your cards. If that works for you, then that's fine. But I don't think it's something that you need to worry excessively about. So rule number 3 that you can ignore is kind of the opposite of rule number 2. And this rule is that the querent, or whoever you're reading for, should touch the cards, that they should shuffle the cards themselves, because then their energy gets embedded in the deck and in the reading. And I don't think that it's absolutely necessary to get the querent to shuffle their own cards. Number 1, I never do this because most people are terrible at shuffling. Most people can't shuffle cards. And so you give them a deck and they awkwardly fumble with it and cards go everywhere and it's just a total disaster. So usually what I do in a reading is I shuffle the deck myself, and then I fan the cards out, and then I let the person pick their own cards. And I feel like that involves them in the reading and they touch the cards, and I like that way best. But a lot of my readings, most of my readings actually I do, are distance readings, so I don't have the person right in front of me, so I can't get them to touch the cards. And so this is where setting an intention is so important. So always having that intention that you're connecting with that person's energy when you're reading for them. And I feel like that is more important than, you know, having them physically touch the cards. So rule number 4 that you can ignore is that you must wrap your tarot deck in a silk cloth when you're not using it. So the idea behind this is good, and the idea is basically to treat your cards with respect when you're not using them. So, you know, your tarot deck is this, think of it as like a really special kind of sacred object, and you don't want to treat it like you would your toothbrush or, you know, other things. You aren't going to just scatter it on your coffee table and use it as, you know, coasters and bookmarks. So I think it's important to store your deck in a way that feels respectful and special. So maybe that for you, that's wrapping it in silk or some other kind of cloth. There's nothing wrong with keeping a tarot deck in the box that it came in. I know there's some people that don't like to do this. I personally don't have a problem with it, but I like to keep my decks somewhere kind of, actually I keep most of them on my bookshelf. And then I have some nice boxes that my dad made me that I keep my decks in. But I think it's more important to just store your deck in a way that feels special to you, but it doesn't have to be in a silk cloth. So rule number 5 is that you absolutely have to memorize all the tarot card meanings before you can give someone else a tarot reading. So this is absolute nonsense. Now I think if you're going to be reading professionally, you should know all the tarot meanings. But I started reading tarot for other people basically as soon as I got my first tarot deck, and I didn't know what any of the meanings were. The people I read for knew that I didn't know what I was doing though, so I revealed that to them. But I feel like when it comes to learning tarot, there's this weird obsession with learning the tarot meanings. Like, people are so focused on that. And I think that it's an important part of learning tarot and understanding tarot, but there's so much more to tarot than just memorizing the meanings. So don't let that hold you back from doing readings. Don't feel like you can't do readings until you know what every single card means. You can learn as you go. That's totally okay. So rule number 6 is that you should never read tarot for yourself. Out of all the stupid rules to ignore, this is the one I hate the most, because the one way that I consistently use my tarot deck is to do readings on myself. That's what I love to do with my tarot cards. So this idea that we shouldn't read for ourselves, I think it comes from this place that, we are going to be so biased, and our bias is going to reflect in our readings. And I think there is some truth to that. Of course, when you read for yourself, especially if you're reading about a topic that you're really emotional about or really jazzed up about, there is going to be some reader bias. I think it's more important to just be aware of that going into doing self-readings and not worry about it too much. So I don't think you should avoid doing self-readings for this reason. And of course, if there's some issue that you're really emotional about, you can always get a friend or a professional reader to do a reading for you, and then you can do a reading for yourself and you can compare and contrast the two readings. Okay, so rule number 7 is that you have to be spiritual to learn tarot, or you have to be born with a gift or with psychic powers in order to learn tarot. This is absolute nonsense, and you don't need to be spiritual to read tarot or to learn tarot. So you don't need to own crystals, you don't need to be into meditation, you don't need to be spiritual at all to learn tarot. And you don't need to be naturally psychic or a born intuitive or anything like that. I get a lot of questions through my website from people who want to learn tarot, but someone told them or they read it on the internet that you have to be psychic in order to learn tarot. And that's totally silly. You do not need to be psychic. If you are psychic or if you are born intuitive, that's awesome. And that kind of gives you a little bit of an advantage, but it is absolutely not required to learn tarot. So the last rule, rule number 8, is never use a secondhand tarot deck. And I think the idea behind this is that the energy of the previous owner is going to be so deeply embedded in this deck that it's going to be impossible to energetically clear the cards. I haven't found this to be the case, so I have a couple of secondhand decks, and I definitely spent extra time clearing those decks. So I wafted my sage smoke over each card. I lay the cards out on the windowsill at night, let the moonlight bathe them. I did a little bit of extra clearing with those cards, and I think I even wiped each card with something, water, something like that. And then I stored my deck in a bag of crystals overnight as well. So I did a little extra clearing. But this idea that you can't use a secondhand deck, or that a secondhand deck is going to have like bad energy attached to it, is really, really silly. Now, if you get a secondhand deck and you do feel like it just has a really uncomfortable energy, and you try clearing it and it still has that uncomfortable energy, then by all means don't use that deck, get rid of that deck. But I feel like this is one of those rules that you can kind of ignore. Okay, so now on to some rules to follow. I've got 4 rules that I personally follow in my tarot practice. You don't have to, but I'm gonna share them with you anyway. So rule number 1 is always clear your deck between readings. This is a rule that I always follow, and I already talked about clearing, so I won't go into it, but I just like to knock on the cards and then shuffle them with the intention that I'm clearing my deck. And I feel like more than anything, this is really just a ritual that helps me close the last reading that I did and get ready for the next reading. So I feel like it's more kind of psychological than energetic, but it's a good practice. It's a good habit to get into. So rule number 2 is, when choosing cards for a reading, choose with your left hand as opposed to your right hand. So the idea behind this is that your left hand is connected to your right brain, and the right side of your brain is your intuitive side, your psychic side, your creative side. So by choosing with your left hand, it's like you're using that intuitive side of you to choose those cards. I like this rule. And this was originally a rule that I was going to put in the myth section and say, you know, you don't have to follow this. But then I thought about it and I thought, no, this is actually something I do all the time in my readings, and I kind of like the idea behind it. So rule number 3 is, if a card flies out of the deck when you're shuffling, you must include it in the reading. This is a rule that I always follow. So if you're shuffling for a reading and you get a jumper card that just whoosh flies out of the deck, don't put that card back in the deck and keep shuffling. Save it. Now, if you have a whole bunch of cards that jump out of the deck, it could just mean you're a bad shuffler, or not, depending on how many cards jump out. But I always see these jumper cards as special cards, and I give kind of extra importance and significance to those cards that came flying out. I kind of feel like they are sort of a message from spirit that's saying, hey, pay attention to this. So the last rule to follow, rule number 4, is don't read for yourself when you're feeling really upset. And this is really hard because this is usually when we want to do a reading for ourselves, when we're upset and we're charged up about something. But when you're really upset, your intuition is not going to be strong. You're not going to be able to look at a reading objectively. And when you're emotional, your brain gets kind of scrambled, and the reading is probably not going to be very helpful for you. So I actually have a video and a blog post on this topic on how to read for yourself when you're upset. So I will put it at the end of this video, and I'll put the link in the description box below this video as well, if you're interested. But basically in that video I say, instead of reading on the issue that you're upset about, read about how you can feel better. So how can you best deal with this situation that's come up for you? How should you approach the situation? What should you be focusing on? How can you feel better in this situation? As opposed to just reading about that thing that's bothering you specifically or directly. Okay, so this has been my 8 tarot rules to ignore and my 4 tarot rules to follow videos. So thank you so much for watching. I know this video was a little longer than what you're used to. So if you stuck with me the whole way, you're awesome. Thank you. And feel free to check out my website, dailytarotgirl.com. I'm going to put the link in the description box below this video. And my website's full of fun tarot learning resources. I've got some tarot spreads, deck reviews, exercises, all kinds of fun stuff. So once again, thank you so much for watching.